Welcome, welcome, welcome. I see a lot of familiar names and faces. My name is Joy Mayer, and I'm the director of Trusting News. And I'm just going to give a super quick welcome here today and then hand it over to my colleagues. We are at Trusting News. We study how people decide what news to trust and then turn that into knowledge journalists can act on about how trust is earned and lost. And a huge part of that is understanding in a deep way what prevents us from serving well the people we are not reaching. And one of the ways we learn about that is by partnering with journalists who are willing to help us learn. And so what we're here to do today as part of a larger effort at Trusting News called A Road to Pluralism, what we're here to do today is share some of the things we've learned about in a recent project that involved some deep conversations with people who don't trust us very much. So my colleague, Molly Muchna, was directing that project for Trusting News. And we also have the leader of our research team, Sue Robinson, here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm gonna hand it on over to them. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Joy. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and share my sound as I share my screen. All right. Well, yes, thank you guys. Like Joy said, I'm Molly Muchna. I'm the project manager at Trusting News, and I'm really thrilled that you guys all came today to hear about this new research and some of the insights that we have to share with the industry. Just a quick agenda for today. We're going to try to keep it short at 45 minutes. We know that it's hard to carve a whole hour out of a Friday, so we'll try to keep it at 45 minutes or even less. But today we're going to go over some of the questions that we are working to solve with this research. Our research partner, Sue, is going to talk about the research, how it worked, and what we found from that. We're going to talk about some themes and insights that our partner journalists heard from the community members that they talked to. We're going to talk more about how you can get involved and also do a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat at any time. I know some of the newsroom partners that we worked with, I see are here. Hi, guys. So if you want to introduce yourself in the chat and say who you are and indicate that you are a participant or share any insights along the way, I would very much welcome that. So before we jump into the research, I just wanted to go ahead and lay groundwork of why it was that we invested in this work. So after the 2020 election, we really heard from journalists how discouraged they were and how they felt like it was such an uphill battle to feel like their work was being seen as credible and ethical and fair by their communities. And so we were working and brainstorming and had a lot of big questions around, what can journalists' role be in helping depolarize our communities and help our coverage be a part of the solution of fostering conversation and connection versus causing additional polarization. So we started this initiative called The Road to Pluralism. And with that initiative, we started it kind of with this kickoff of research where we had a lot of newsroom partners talk to people who were conservative or right-leaning in their communities. And one of the things that we saw from that research and the interviews that those newsroom partners did was that they saw that there was some missteps between how they were viewing. I don't know if you guys don't mind muting yourselves, just one more reminder, thank you. But part of that, they saw these missteps from between how the coverage that they were providing of their communities and then the coverage that the communities were wanting, or communities feeling like they weren't being totally reflected in the coverage that journalists were doing. And so part of what we set out to do in this next round of research, and as we continued in this pluralism project, was to understand and help journalists figure out how they could understand who they're serving and how that they could do that better. We also just know from research that how journalists view how they do their job and how the public perceives how journalists do their job vary greatly. This is some research from Pew that was released a few months ago this summer that just shows the difference between how journalists think they function in all these different categories and how the public thinks that journalists function. The maroon bar is journalists, and Pew surveyed journalists, and you can see that in all these different categories, including reporting the news accurately and giving voice to the underrepresented, that journalists thought that they did a much better job at these things than the public thought, which obviously shows a gap in knowledge there. This is just another stat to show how many people feel like journalists just don't even care about people like them, which I think is a pretty stark thing to sit with, that 40% of people thought that journalists really cared about people like them. And then on top of that, we also just know that journalists aren't really that not many people have ever even spoken to a journalist. This was research from Pew a few years ago, but showed that only 21% of US adults had ever even spoken with a journalist. And then we can see that that number goes down the less old, white, rich, and educated you are. So kind of just highlights to show who as an industry as a whole journalists are talking to and who, what perspectives might be missing. So this really left us with this question of like, if journalists are trying to provide a public service and really trying to meet the needs of their community, like how can journalists really meet the needs of their community if they don't know what people need from us? How can we accurately represent communities that the media has disregarded, ignored, potentially even really harmed in the past without understanding those perceptions of those people in the community? And one of our fundamental beliefs at Trusting News is that journalists will make more informed decisions about what it means to serve the public if we just understand more and are in more conversation and connection with the people that we aim to serve. So that was one of the questions that we set out to answer with this research, was how can journalists foster these connections and these conversations? How can they make sure to build this into their routines and their workflows? How can they, learn about diverse people in their communities, especially when those people might not be represented in the newsrooms themselves? How can those efforts reflect people's hesitancy or unwillingness to engage at all? If they have really low trust in news, what is it that journalists can do to try to help remedy that? And then what are some insights from these community members about what journalists could do to do a better job of serving the needs of these communities? So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sue. Again, Sue was a really integral part of this research and led it, both the research and the analyzing the data for us. So I'm going to hand it off to her to talk more about it.
Thanks, Molly. Hi, everybody. I want to first acknowledge as well that we have another researcher, Patrick Johnson, who's also been working with us. He's at Iowa, but right now he's defending his dissertation proposal, so he could not make it. And then we also have Josh, who's at LSU, Josh Starr, sorry. And he's at LSU. He's also on the call, but he's working on a different part of this project. And then finally, I want to shout out to all of these 9 partner journalists that conducted these 76 conversations with people in their communities. So because they really did the lion's share of the work. Molly, I don't know if you can switch this slide. Oh, there we go. So we had these 76 conversations with people, and in addition to that, we asked all of the community members who got interviewed to fill out community member surveys to find out what they thought about the conversation, whether that conversation changed anything for them. We had more than 50% response rate for that, which is really, really good. And then we also had each journalist fill out a log about each conversation. And then finally, we did a focus group with participating journalists. So we had quite a lot of data to work with here. Now, the community members, I'm sure you're interested in who they are, and each journalist was able to choose who they wanted to reach. And so we ended up with quite a diverse sample of community members. About half of them identified as either conservative or independent. And about, sorry, there's a typo there, that's my fault. And about 40% identified as a person of color. And that held true even for the 44 who filled out the survey. So the most striking thing I think everybody wants to know is that these conversations mattered. They were just conversations. They weren't really interviews. I mean, the journalists really there just to listen. And they didn't respond very much. I was really impressed with how the journalists were so restrained, I guess, and some of the things that people were saying to them was kind of crazy. But the end result was that 86% of our respondents, that is the community members, said they felt a sense of trust building with either that journalist or the particular news organization after this conversation. And all of them had said they had held very little distrust before it. And even almost a third were considering subscribing, which is crazy considering the kinds of things that they were saying to people. So I will say that there was a lot of contradiction that we heard in terms of what journalists should do, as you can imagine, and as you have heard probably yourself on the streets. Everybody thinks news is biased in some way, but when they drill down into thinking about, well, what does that mean exactly? The understanding of bias changed, whether they thought that journalists were too liberal or journalists were too white or whatever. So there were some different ideas about what they wanted journalists to do about that. Everybody felt that journalists were way underfunded, and they blamed newsrooms for that. And as a result of that, some people expressed that they felt like journalists didn't really understand their communities at all, and therefore couldn't report competently about them. And you also know that people are pretty polarized, and they blame journalists for that. The majority of these respondents felt like journalists, yeah, they're a cause of that polarization and they need to stop doing that, and that they also have a role in decreasing that polarization. And that was kind of a new finding that we haven't seen much of in research that I wanted to point out. And then of course, everybody wants just the facts, right? Just the facts meant something different to everybody, whether they were a person of color, whether they were conservative or whatever. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this dichotomy a little later. Okay, Molly. Yeah. So the bottom line, though, is that journalists thought that these conversations were worth their time, that they were really useful in understanding how to reach different kinds of audiences that they don't reach now. That was kind of one of the parameters we gave them. That they felt like they were developing a personal connection with some of these community members, and also it was revealed to them language juices and in actions or inactions that they were doing that were causing some of this distrust. So that was useful. And then finally, the last slide, Molly. Community members themselves, they were very, very forthright with all of these journalists. They felt like these conversations showed them that journalists actually do care about them and people like them, which I think contributed to this finding that these conversations helped them build trust. And they felt very, very respected by the journalists. You know, even some of them who were expressing very vitriolic emotions around journalists in particular, like really kind of negative stuff, felt like, oh, this journalist that I just talked to, he or she clearly understood me, clearly cared about me in some way. And I thought that that was super interesting.
Awesome. Thank you, Sue, for sharing that. So like Sue was saying, the journalists heard a lot of feedback, both positive and negative, from the community members that they talked to, and were logging their experiences along the way about just the attitudes that they felt towards news and different things that they heard from the community members. And so at the end, we looked at all of the things of their findings and insights that community members shared with them, kind of about what they should and shouldn't be doing in terms of covering their communities. And we compiled that into some advice that they newsroom partners had about how they could reach diverse audiences. If you work in audience engagement or have, even worked in journalism, some of these, probably seem like things you've heard before, or probably, kind of basic things, but are things that I think a lot of newsrooms really struggle with doing and committing to doing regularly. And one of those is just being consistent and present. So I want to first share a highlight from Brittany Harlow, who is a newsroom partner who helped with this. Brittany works at the Verified News Network. I think Brittany's here. Hey, Brittany. And on their project, they're focusing on reaching the indigenous communities and hearing from the indigenous communities in Oklahoma.
One way these conversations helped give me insight into how we could better reach indigenous communities was just the feedback of being present in that community. You hear so much about how the news people just land in communities when there's a big story going on, but that is, very self-serving, as opposed to being there serving those people on a regular basis, being a part of that community, and that give and take relationship, especially with the indigenous community outreach that we have done. That is a very important cultural and historical context and matter of importance to be not just self-serving and taking from the tribes, but being there on a regular basis, helping, being a presence. And so that is something that we're going to be working on to do more, is being a part of those communities. One way these conversations helped give.
Sorry about that. Worked a slideshow before. But something I thought Brittany said that was really interesting was just, again, that piece of being a really active member of the community. Something that I heard from a lot of the community reflections and from journalists when they spoke to these community members, that is they really noticed when journalists parachuted in for whether it was a big story or a big crime happening in the area. They noticed when journalists weren't present normally and then for whatever reason kind of swooped in to cover something and then swooped back out. And what the community members emphasized, like Brittany was saying, was really we're emphasizing the importance of just showing up on a regular basis, right? And being a present member, being an active member of those communities, or at least trying to be. And some things that community members said that they wanted to see from journalists specifically was that they just wanted to see, again, journalists present in those communities, but they also just wanted to see them like at community events, at community spaces, at community like stores and markets and farmers markets and things like that. Something interesting that one person said was that they would love to see a journalist show up at a community event that wasn't related to, quotes for a story, covering a story, or selling subscriptions or doing marketing, just being there for the sake of being present and learning more about that community. Another thing that we heard, or that our partner journalists heard, was about not just writing the negative news, which I think is something that we hear from communities quite a bit. And we know that sometimes that's not the news that's the most read, but I'm going to share some insights from Robin Tate-Rockel from IPB News, and she's going to share a little bit more about what she heard from that.
One thing that really stuck with me was how people shared that through the past year or two, people have distanced themselves from the news because of everything that had happened, the pandemic, how all of the impact that had, the fallout, and so people were seeing so much negativity and things that weighed on them and the news that they were deciding not to interact with it. And so when asked what they would want to see more of, many people would say, I want to see more positive news stories. And I know that's something that I see talked about a lot within reporters and journalists and news organizations of how sometimes people don't click on those things, or people don't always, they'll say they want that, but then that's not really the stories that are paid attention to. So when I dug deeper with, well, what would that look like for you? What type of topics do you follow, and what kind of stories do you want to see about that? People were sharing that they want to see stories of how community members are working together to create positive change within their communities. So they wanted those stories highlighted of, one topic that came up a lot that people followed or wanted more stories of was education. And one person gave the example of, let's share stories of teachers and the relationships they create with their students. Some of those positive, uplifting stories for teachers to see of themselves represented, them creating a better community, as opposed to most of the education news stories, which show kind of not the positive side of being a teacher. And so I think it'll be important when people say they want the positive news stories to dig into that a little more. Well, what does that look like for you? What does that mean? What type of stories are those? What deserves focus within your community? And really start with listening to community members on what type of stories they want to see, and starting there to create the positive news stories, as opposed to just, deciding what a positive news story for your community is and sharing it with them. One thing that really stuck with me was
one thing I thought that was so great that Robin said was that idea again of asking community members what they thought positive stories. Again, overwhelmingly, almost a majority, I would say, of community members said they wanted to see more positive coverage of their communities and more positive stories. And they really felt like that lack of positive stories was because journalists weren't connected with the communities, that they didn't really get to know communities beyond political leaders or police or high power members. But something really interesting, that there was some nuance there, where when they were talking about positive stories, a lot of the times they weren't just talking about those really feel good stories or like the pat you on the back stories of like they only wanted positive coverage of those communities. What they more meant by that, and as journalists asked to dig deeper in those questions, was more that they wanted more contextual stories about the communities, right? Like more nuanced, more representative coverage. So it wasn't just saying like, oh, like there's only really good things in this community. What they wanted was more of just a breadth of coverage that showed, all sides of things, and showed, how the community members are working together to do cool things in the community, while also, providing coverage about long-term issues and things like that. Which leads us into this next reflection that Newsroom Partners heard, was really about how to make your coverage reflective. So I'm going to share some insights from Peter Hawapi at the Day, and they were focused mostly on talking to people who were more conservative.
So I think it's important that journalists make time for these type of interactions, because if we don't, we end up working in an echo chamber where we're only reporting for and about people who are like us. One person told me that she didn't think we were intentionally biased, but that we just tend to reach out to the same kinds of people over and over again. And they're people that look like us or think like us, not because that's the only people that we care about, but just because that's who is the most convenient to us. I think that it's important that we report on everybody in our community and for everybody in our community. And we can't do that if we're not hearing from everybody about what is important in their lives. So I think it's important.
Yeah, so I love what Peter said about how that woman didn't think that we were being intentionally biased, but more of just the people that we tend to tap are people who, again, are people who are sometimes the loudest people. That was something we heard from a lot of the community members, was that they felt like journalists relied too heavily on overgeneralizations and just listening to like the most polarizing person in a group, and really missed a wide breadth of people who had more nuanced views about issues, or more nuanced views in the community as a whole. And so one of the solutions that journalists felt like that could help remedy this was to host some regular listening sessions, or doing these types of interviews and conversations more regularly with their communities. And then something that the community members suggested was just interviewing and talking to people who they identified as more like everyday people. So people who weren't necessarily influencers in the community or in like official positions of power, or weren't elected officials, but instead were people who were more just, the single mom who works in the community, or people like that. The last thing that we heard from community members is that they really did notice journalist diversity, or really the lack of diversity. People really wanted to see journalists from the newsrooms who looked like them, who held the same beliefs, who were from the same areas, who had similar life experiences. And that was a thing that some community members said was really glaring in their local news, or in just news in general, when journalists were asking about their perceptions and how they felt about the news, is that they just felt like there weren't people in the news that represented their lives, or they didn't see people who looked like them, right? And this was something that we heard in that initial research that I talked about at the beginning of this. And so last year, with some partner journalists, as well as we worked with some partner journalists, as well as some HR departments, to create a hiring guide that I think Joy will stick in the chat for people to see. And we basically created this hiring guide, knowing that this isn't a simple issue to fix, right? Like this isn't something that just having one conversation or doing more outreach is going to fix for journalists. This is, a long game thing. But we really wanted to figure out what it is that newsrooms could do to invite more what we are calling dimensions of difference into their newsrooms. So, it's diversity of thought, diversity of lived experience, as well as racial diversity as well. And so what are some questions that hiring editors could ask that are, legal and sensitive, but also could help kind of get at the heart of what these prospective job candidates, like what their life experiences is and the things that they would bring to the team. So we have that list of questions, and would love to hear if you use any of them, or have feedback on any of that. So if this is something that seems like you would want to replicate in your work, if you feel like having these conversations you agree are really important in your community and are seeing the benefit, we did create a community interview guide that you can use to that will help walk you through how to do these. It's everything from, how to identify which communities might be underreached in your area, how to figure out which voices you might want to include in your coverage, figuring out who it is that you want to talk to. That was something that we heard from partner journalists in the project, that it was, obviously part of the point of this project was to talk to people who had low trust in news or people who weren't already part of your sphere of supporters in journalism. So that means it was a little bit harder to connect with people and find people to talk to. So we have some tips and some guidance on how to find people in the community that you can talk to. And then we have a list of questions that you can ask. We revised these questions based on this last round of research. So we had both input from community members and input from the journalists about like which questions felt helpful and helped guide these conversations. So you'll find that. I think Joy will also stick that in the chat for you guys. And we're continuing on this road to pluralism. And hopefully in the next week or two, we're going to be releasing some additional data that Sue alluded to that Josh, who's on this call, is helping with. But we're continuing to look and test with newsrooms, and particularly this next research that we're going to be releasing is insights into the language and framing of both what journalists felt and news consumers feel like is polarizing, and what newsrooms can do in terms of headlines and word choice and story framing to make their coverage seem less polarizing and help it, instead of sparking outrage, spark more curiosity in their communities. So the best way to get involved with that, or to the best way to get that research is to follow along our weekly newsletter, which is a Trust Tips newsletter. It's a once a week newsletter where we send a quick actionable tip for how you can earn trust with your community. We also have more information about our Pluralism network. And so if this is work that you're interested in, if you'd like to potentially partner with us as we continue to think about new research and experiments that we do with other newsrooms, and you're interested in doing that with us, we'll stick a link in the chat as well about a form that you could fill out to just indicate that interest. And then we are also going to be having a really interesting conversation on September 2nd. That will be with Joy, who kicked off this call, and the super smart Amanda Ripley, who wrote that book, High Conflict. And this will really touch on that point of tension that Sue talked about before in the research findings of how different people in the community wanted different things from journalists, and how there's just some people in the community who don't trust news, who are not acting in good faith, or who potentially hold some extremist views, and kind of understanding that there's some people that journalists just aren't going to reach, and who are those people, and how can we have those conversations in newsrooms. So we'll also stick a link in the chat for to register for that if you want to attend. All right, well, thank you guys so much. I have not been paying attention to the chat, so I don't know if there's any questions, but if you guys want to, Joy, read any off, or if you guys want to chime in, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, we're having a good conversation here. I'm not sure. There are a couple things. So Robin, while I look through and maybe pull out some questions, Robin, I wonder if I could put you on the spot to elaborate on what you just posted about ways to address positive stories.
Yeah. And, a couple of things I threw in there. It's like, if you're working with the community to kind of pinpoint these stories and kind of redirect the ship of possibly negative or discriminatory representations people felt that we were having when we had this conversation and conversations with people, was making sure you share it back with them. Maybe they will put it in a newsletter. Maybe they'll put it up on their social media, share it out with friends and family. And also community conversations are always great, whether they're in person or digital. I think it's a great way to reshare some of the stories that you've done, maybe gather more information or topics people are interested in to further that work. But it's a great way of getting those stories back out there and including community members as panelists or speakers, along with the reporters on some of the recent positive stories that have come out.
Can I piggyback a little bit?
Please.
So I just want to mention that one of the biggest challenges for our 9 journalists was trying to get people to agree to do these, and we haven't addressed that quite yet. But I was really impressed with how resourceful the journalists were in trying to find people. Now, remember, these should be people who are not already in your audience, right? Because a whole idea here is to expand your reach in your different communities, expand revenue streams, and expand understanding in different communities and all of that. But I would love if some of these 9 journalists could put in the chat some of the ways in which you got people, but just from the logs, like Peter went to Reddit groups, subreddit groups that were talking about local news. People were accessing community organizations and community leaders and asking people to introduce them to certain people. Some people were using their personal networks to get people who they knew just hated all local journalists. But so don't assume that when you decide, oh, I'm going to do these weekly, just leave some time to try to figure out how you're going to reach those people.
Yeah, definitely. And again, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was that, I think we really wanted to try to figure out like a hack for journalists on how they could do this and really like make time for this and what they could do to make it even easier as they work it into their routines, so that because I think a lot of journalists agree that this is really, really important to do, but it's just the finding the time right in your workflows, and when you're kind of stuck in your old routines, this is a different way of approaching journalism, so it's hard to shift to that. And I think what we learned is that there's no real secret to it beyond just prioritizing it and making the time for it. But I do, hopefully those tips in terms of how to find people makes that process of it a little bit easier.
There were lots of conversation going back and forth in the chat about what is the right number, how many should you do them? And the point is not to get a representative sample or to meet the research criteria that our academic partners might prefer that we reach. It's about, do you want the knowledge, and how much are you willing to invest to get the knowledge in service of better coverage, right? You're not just learning things to learn things, you're learning things so that you can make decisions about coverage with reaching new audiences in mind. And so imagine, if you work on a team of 4 reporters, imagine if you each did one a month. And at the end of the year, you would have had really good conversations with 52 people in your community. And you take the time to look through that and look for themes. And we're happy to talk to you about what that process could look like. It's really decent new knowledge for conversations that if it 30 minutes a week is 1/80th of your work week. Of course, it takes time to recruit people and set them up as well. But it seems to us like the time commitment over time is really worth it. Colleen, I love what you just put in the chat about what you want to hear from people. What would you like to see in my coverage on this topic going forward? That's such a good question. The what's missing. One of my favorite questions to ask is what do journalists typically get wrong about this topic or about people in your community? Joe, can you say more about the comment you just put in the chat? Hi, thank you for being here. I don't know if you're able to unmute. Joe was one of the journalists who worked with us on the project, and she said, after having participated in this, I'm thinking the conversation should be an ongoing effort year round. Oh, no problem. Thank you, Joe. Can't unmute. One comment I would love to circle back to, if we can, is the comment from Bonnie. Bonnie, I don't know if you're in a spot where you could unmute or if you want me to read it.
Sure, I can unmute.
Okay.
One thing that I'm the opinion editor for the Louisville Courier-Journal, so I deal with the community forum. So outreach, I feel like, is a consistent part of my job. But I had a recent op-ed that actually ended up on the phone with this individual, trying to explain to them that what they were perceiving as ill intent or biased language was actually our adherence to AP style. And what they were upset about was our shift from saying pro-life and pro-choice to saying anti-abortion and abortion rights. And they thought that that was a very biased way to present the sides of the position. So I do run up against that a lot with AP style is progressive, I guess, in their language and their direction on things. And that can be a point of contention for some of our more conservative readers.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things we find is that people have so many misassumptions about how journalism works, and it would never occur to them that we have a style in mind, that we follow a specific style, that it's not an individual writer deciding that based on his or her personal preference, right? So one of the things we recommend is injecting some transparency around that consistency. So get on the record somewhere about what labels you use and why. get on the record so that you can link back to it each time, either from individual stories or editorials or from comments when people complain online and oh, we explained actually why we use those specific labels. So a lot of complaints are based on things that we do on purpose and just don't explain. Other complaints are based on things, are really valid, I think, and based on things that we don't even notice ourselves doing that do reflect the values or bias or worldview of people in the newsroom that are different from people in the community. And I don't think we're honest enough about those either.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, Colleen made a great point about adding the editor's note on abortion stories going forward, and exactly what Joy is saying, but two is making sure that it's in each of your coverage when you're using that word. I think that's something that a lot of newsrooms we work with will be excited about creating, like adding transparency around their language and things like that. But then we see that lives on an about page and never really, people who are reading those opinion stories never see that. So making sure that there's some indication in each of those stories that points to, why you're using that language. So that could be like an editor's note that directs to a policy of like, here's why we adhere to AP style. Here's why we use these terms over these terms, and just could direct people to that policy so that they see that every time they see you guys using those word choices.
Even if they don't agree with the decision, some people will say, unless you refer to me with the label that I prefer, or my stance or my group of people with the label I prefer, I'm not going to think you're being fair. That doesn't mean you have to do it, but there is trust built by being on the record about how you're making the choices and showing that it's consistent, that it isn't just the whim of the individual journalists. I love the example Mike put in the chat of something they did when they started capitalizing the word Black, which was AP style, but audience doesn't know that, your community doesn't know that, and why it's consistent with the values of your newsroom to follow that style is worth articulating.
Sue, I love that point that you put in the chat about just, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
About the networks. So I wrote a book in 2018 talking specifically to Black and Brown people who are not engaged with mainstream news about why they weren't engaged. And out of that research, and also we heard this as well in the community conversations, is that people just assume that they're not supposed to trust you, whether they're a rural conservative, whether they're urban Black person, whatever. And they have no idea what you're doing, right? They have no idea what you're writing about or publishing. They just assume that you're overly liberal, that you're too white, that you don't care about them. And so what these conversations seem to be doing is breaking through that cycle. And so it's not just talking to that one person, but it's talking to that person's friend group. And that person's family group, because this is pretty a unique opportunity for them, and they're gonna talk about that. Like, here's what I just did yesterday. Like, let's take another look at this media organization. I mean, that's kind of the hope, right?
Let me put in another plug for our conversation next week with Amanda Ripley, because the reason we asked Amanda, who is so smart, and if you haven't read, you might be familiar with the essay she wrote a few years ago called Complicating the Narrative, that she wrote for Solutions Journalism that just went nuts. She's so smart about how journalists can tell more complex stories and make more people feel like the nuance of their lives is reflected in journalism. And the reason we asked Amanda to join us in conversation next week is that we're hearing from our partner journalists a lot of tension around kind of when they can stop listening and who is not worth listening to. I had a cab driver this week who just really wanted to throw down about climate change and COVID and things that, what the journalists get wrong because they're just not telling the truth, right? And if only we would watch the documentaries he's watching, then we would tell the truth. So at some point you have to just cut that off. And we're not suggesting that that newsrooms will need to continually engage that cab driver in conversations about how they should be better covering climate change. At some point, facts are facts. We are suggesting that many people are still on the playing field of facts and engage with news in really different ways and are frustrated with the news in ways that we don't understand because we don't have it as part of our habits to ask them. So we believe in asking, and we also want to just really wrestle with the meaty conversation of what does it look like to talk to people who see the world so differently that it might be that we don't share the same set of facts, and when do we just sort of assume, when do we give ourselves permission to say, that is not who we're trying to reach. It is not reasonable for us to think that we will meet each other there. I don't know if that's something folks here have struggled with, but it's something we're hearing a lot from our partner newsrooms.
Yeah, I mean, one of the very weird things we heard, and I wouldn't say this was a majority of the community members for sure, but a little segment of them, particularly the white conservatives, said that, you know, even if the news organization wrote anything about LGBTQ or anything about race or anything about these supposedly progressive topics, that they didn't want it. And that meant that this news organization was liberal. It didn't matter what was printed, like what the content was, even if the content was straight. And clearly we're not going to go back to not covering these communities, right? I mean, they're going to have to deal with that. I would love to hear other people's suggestions about whether those people are worth, you know, interacting with, or like how you can kind of normalize this kind of content for those people. And they tended to be older generation, right?
Well, what we work with a lot is the idea that, so there are the people on the extreme who see any mention of those things as evidence of bias and write you off, right? So maybe they're not reachable, but there are other people who have milder reactions and say, gosh, is everything about race these days? And so how do we explain why we're covering these things? One idea might be, here are the demographics of our community. And so this might not be, these communities might not be ones you're familiar with, ones that you see in your lives every day, but we are not doing our job as a public service to this community if we do not cover the diversity of our community in these ways. So are you on the record about that? About why it's important to you to cover which types of, here's how the community breaks down, here's how we are holding ourselves accountable for serving them all well. And this is story is part of that effort.
I'll just, since I don't mean to keep talking, but I just want to mention one more thing, which is that it's super important if you decide to do these community conversations, that you don't get defensive with them or start arguing with them. Like our 9 journalists were so cool. I mean, they were just getting all these like really bizarre statements thrown at them, and they were just there to listen. And the minute you start going into a back and forth, the minute it all breaks down. So that would be a piece of advice that I would give to people after listening to all these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And that community interview guide we have has some of those insights from journalists there, and in terms of how to posture yourself for those conversations, right? Like some of the journalists found it was really effective, which makes sense, right? To posture yourself in a way of humility, of acknowledging past harm that your newsroom has potentially caused to these communities, or harm just by ignoring those communities in the past, acknowledging that whatever privileges you have, even if that privilege is just the fact that you're the journalist in the situation and sitting down with a community member. So really being aware of those dynamics, and you know, like Sue said, really coming in a more curiosity-driven, less defensive posture, I think is really important as you enter these conversations. We're just about at 45 minutes, so I think probably good to wrap up. Thank you guys for all the really good questions and discussion, and for again coming today and hearing about it. I'll put a link to the slides in the chat, so if you guys want to follow along, we'll also email out a recording of this after the fact if you want to come back to any of those. Again, if you guys want to get in touch, I'll stick our email in the chat as well. We'd love to continue to hear any insights or feedback you have if you use this community interview guide. Thank you guys so much for coming. Bye.